Good morning. My name is Andrew Margenot. I'm a soil scientist at the University of Illinois, and I'm here to share with you some thoughts on early insights to phosphorus that we're coming across as we update the Illinois Agronomy Handbook. So, I first want to apologize for not being there in person. I wasn't able to make it. I have a different talk in Illinois today. However, I still think that some of the main concepts can come across pretty readily remotely. So, as part of this talk, I want to emphasize that we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into history. We're not just going to talk about modern agronomic recommendations to phosphorus based upon ongoing work in Illinois on how to update recommendations on P. We're also going to be going back to understand how we got here. I feel strongly that it can be useful to understand the journey over the course of decades for a given science, and we will do that today with phosphorus. So let's begin with a bit of backstory in terms of the story of phosphorus. How was it managed or not managed in the north central region from Illinois all the way up to Minnesota, going back to the 1800s? First thing to understand is that phosphorus is a relatively new technology, so to speak. It is a fertilizer input that has only been a input really since the 1940s. So before this period, or really before the 1900s, we can think of us being in a world where there was no real net input of phosphorus to cropping systems. I'm saying net because manure is oftentimes not a net input. If you think about where the phosphorus in the manure came from, if you're in a pasture system, the cattle were simply a means by which phosphorus from the soil natively there was being removed, retransferred to a different part of the farm. But there were some limited inputs of bone meal in this pre-fertilizer phase. Now, the line that you're seeing here on the x-axis is the global mining of rock phosphates, from which all current P fertilizers are from. So we see that the mining of rock phosphate really takes off by the 1950s, post World War II. And that's when we see the use of phosphate rock itself directly as an input. This was then followed by the superphosphates phase, and finally ending with the ammonium phosphate phase, in which we find ourselves today. These increases in phosphorus rock mining have been largely to support the replenishment of phosphorus exported from fields with biomass harvest. So, in our context of the Midwest, we're really talking here about the phosphorus in the grain of corn, soybean, wheat. For every bushel taken off a field, there's phosphorus also taken out. And in my opinion, to be sustainable, one has to, at a minimum, replenish what's being taken off, being at a neutral balance of nutrients. So if we look at the trajectory of corn yields across the US, we see that the global mining of phosphate rock fits that curve decently well. Now, let's take a look at this curve here. We see that prior to the 1930s, 1940s, that corn yields in this country were pretty much stagnant. We were hovering around 30 bushel per acre. And this is important because the yields of corn used to be even higher, but only after the breaking of the prairies. So I want us now to talk about the pre-fertilizer phase and walk through these different phases and think about what was going on with phosphorus, how it was or was not being managed. So, if we think about the world before phosphorus fertilizers were available and accessible as a net input, we can pretty much estimate that there was net mining of phosphorus, but also other nutrients. Now, there's data from USDA that we just saw that goes back until 1866, and they indicate 30 to 40 bushels per acre, and 40 is being generous. This is for corn. If you go even farther back, right around Illinois statehood, we find that the writings of folks like John Woods, shown here, an Englishman going through what is today Illinois, talking about corn yields. At the time, they called it Indian corn. And he reports that in that era, Shortly after the transition of tallgrass prairie into cropland, 60 to 80 bushels was thought to be a good corn crop, and it was not uncommon to hear of 100 to even 132 bushel per acre corn. This is open, pollinated, hill-planted corn with no nitrogen or phosphorus or potash being added, and still pretty high yields given given that environment. Now, if we go to the more generous average of 35, or sorry, the more realistic average of 35 bushel per acre corn, and we do some math on how much NP and K is in every bushel, during this time period from the 1820s through 1866 and even to 1930, so over 100 years, the per acre removal rates and thus mining were roughly 6 pounds of P per acre. And that's elemental P, not P2O5. So I think we could interpret this initial high yield of corn following prairie conversion, reflecting that there's lots of nutrients being unlocked with tillage, as they said, breaking the prairie. Now, that would include phosphorus, especially organic phosphorus, mineralizing, like nitrogen, into an inorganic and thus bioavailable form. Now, if you're cropping for 110 years at 35 bushel per acre without putting much on, you can do some basic math. We're talking on the order of 60 plus pounds of P per acre mined. Now, this mining led to a lot of concerns that agriculture in the US, but especially in the Midwest, was unsustainable. And this is a letter shown here on the right from the first soil scientist at the U of I, Dr. Cyril Hopkins. And he's writing in Nature, the very famous scientific journal, arguing with European colleagues about how unsustainable US agriculture is. And what the Europeans were pointing out is that, look, if you don't put back on what you're taking off with harvest, you're going to exhaust your soils. And they point out that this is going to happen even in the rich prairies of Illinois and other parts of the Midwest. This was now being seen in the eastern states, like in New England, and it was only a matter of time it was being argued before it popped up in the Midwest. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that the emphasis is on replacing what's being taken off. And arguably the first nutrient where this was being done in the Corn Belt was phosphorus. So Dr. Hopkins was, I would argue, a little bit obsessed on phosphate, specifically phosphate rock. And the rationale here was that one can provide the nitrogen by clovers and alfalfa, as they were back then, but you can't really bring a net input of phosphorus to the system unless you're adding it as a fertilizer. As a result, if we don't, we're going to end up mining the phosphorus, or as they would say back then, phosphoric acid. This then is why there's such a big emphasis on phosphate rock specifically, finely ground. It also served as a mild liming source as well, but there's also prescriptions to add lime. So the idea here was if you have clover for your nitrogen, you've got limestone for the right pH, then the keystone that would meld the other two stones together would be the phosphate rock. Part of this was the economics. The data simply showed, as you can see here, that adding nitrogen or potash back then, this is in the 1900s, early 1910 period, it simply didn't pay. The fertilizer wasn't worth the yield increases, whereas it did pay for phosphorus. So, one thing that I admire about this approach that I think we've gotten away from a bit is beginning with the economics. What's the economic ROI on our phosphate applications? A bit of background here. So, all phosphate fertilizers or P fertilizers are derived from phosphate rock. It is largely sedimentary deposits. We're talking 6 to 12% P content. And what we do is that we mine this phosphate rock, largely found in North Africa, and it's either acidulated with sulfuric acid to make superphosphates, or we combine it with phosphoric acid to make the ammonium phosphates. Now, this is really important because this explains why there's appreciable amounts of sulfur in superphosphates like triple super, and why there's much, much lower, really trace levels in the ammonium phosphates like MAP and DAP. So that would be arguably phase one of phosphate fertilizer use was the use of rock phosphate. The next phase was superphosphates, where there was a brief period of time, relatively speaking, where they made quite an impression on the agricultural scene of the Corn Belt. So this, for example, from the 1929 publication from the U of I Ag Station, pointing out that, hey, superphosphate is a viable option, and unlike rock phosphate, it contains sulfur, something that there's increased interest in today. Now, I realize it can be difficult to source TSP in much of the Corn Belt, though there are sources out there through groups like OCP or ICL and carried by different providers. Note again the economics, in this case, doing the math on what's the cheapest source of phosphorus. And a lot of the consternation at the time was that there were these new synthetic combined fertilizers, what we would think of as NPK fertilizers. And there's a lot of math going on as are you better off just buying a 0.460 of TSP or super single phosphate versus a combined, say, 20-20-20, for example. We then had phase three, which is the ammonium phosphate. And as we can see from this bulletin publication from the U of I, in the 1960s, there was full-fledged assessments of ammonium phosphates being compared to things like triple superphosphate, called here treble superphosphate. Now, if we look at USDA data, they show that by the 1960s, superphosphate was well on the scene in the blue line, and that we see the entry of DAP in 1960, and it has a precipitous increase in usage. Now, this is US-wide sales of these different P forms, but you can make out pretty clearly that as DAP and then later on as MAP came onto the scene, we saw a concomitant decrease in the sales of triple superphosphorus. So really the ammonium phosphates displace the superphosphates, and as we all know, they're largely the dominant source of phosphorus. In Illinois, for example, as much of the US, based upon sales data, the rough estimate that we have is 88% of P sales are ammonium phosphates, which also includes ammonium polyphosphates, APP, as a starter. Now, this is a good place to pause, I think, and think about what have we learned. So if we think about what was the focus in Dr. Hopkins' time, he's the gentleman looking on the left-hand photo up at the camera, versus today. This is in the Morrow plots being sampled in 1904 versus 2023. In those 100 and now 11 years that have elapsed, what have we learned about phosphorus that we might want to maybe back off and focus instead our resources on less low-hanging fruit? And this is part of what we're doing in updating the Illinois Agronomy Handbook, is to sit back a bit and reconceptualize what are the fundamental needs that should be met and an update to the state agronomy handbook recommendations on phosphorus. So let's go back to the writings of Hopkins. Hopkins, again, was writing in the 1900s, and I want to point out that he figured out some things that we might be trying to finesse today without a huge ROI for. Here's an example, the harvest index. If you do the math on what they thought the harvest index to be, they think that's about 74% in 1908. Harvest index, again, is the amount of P percent-wise taken up by the crop that is in the grain and thus harvested. And we know from today's values in the last iteration of the state agronomy handbook, as it is for most Corn Belt states, it's about 78%. So that's a 5% accuracy. That's pretty impressive given the tools they had in the 1900s. And the same goes for the P removal rates, which is the same basic data, but now expressed as how much P2O5 per bushel is taken off the field. And in this case, they estimate 0.39 pounds of P2O5. Our agronomy handbook value that we'll talk about later is estimating 0.37, so within 6%. If we think about things such as uh, how much phosphorus is in soils, the estimates that Hopkins came up with is roughly 7,000 pounds of P per acre. This is not a soil test value. This is a total phosphorus concentration expressed as a stock. Now, this is trickier to evaluate because the P stocks vary by soil type, but if we look at the soil types in the region that he was working in this bulletin, he's spot on. So Pretty impressive to be within 6% accuracy in 1908 of what we know now to be, well, or what we think now to be true in 2025. Same goes for how we manage inputs of phosphorus. So, the prescription, if we do some math based on phosphate rock that Hopkins was proposing, was 1,000 pounds of phosphate rock per year, sorry, per acre, every 5 years, more or less. And it was actually a range he gave, every 5 or 6 years, as we can see in the text. Now, if we assume a 12% P2O5 value, then we can do some math here. Sorry, a 12.5% P value, not P2O5. On a P2O5 basis, we're talking about 57 pounds per acre per year. That's pretty close to what we often recommend as a default in Illinois of 200 pounds of DAP every 2 years, which is basically 100 pounds of DAP equivalent every year per acre. So it's a little bit more, but that's also on a 5 year basis. If you do it on a 6 year basis, as he does write in the text here, then it's spot on. The buildup. Now, there was no soil test until 1945. That was the Bray-Kurtz test, or what we call the Bray P1. So we can't really evaluate, and Hopkins wasn't even aware of these soil tests, but the concept of building soil tests which is manifest in these writings as applying above the maintenance rate that is present in the writing. And finally, the profitability. What I keep harping on is, I think, quite important, thinking about the return on investment by valorizing the dollar per unit of phosphorus added and then the grain increase. So again, this I think is one of the two things that we may have missed. We know that they've established things like the amount of P2O5 per bushel, etc. They're impressively spot on. Themes that I think we may ourselves have lost track of would be one, what's the return to phosphorus? We have a maximum return to nitrogen, an MRTN. Really, they were thinking about an MRTP in 1908. And I think it's probably time for the Corn Belt states to band together and just like we've done for MRTN to make an MRTP. And that, in fact, is one of our targets for the updates to the Illinois Agronomy Handbook. Another concept that is unique to Illinois today that used to be present in Wisconsin and Iowa recommendations, but no longer, is that of subsoil supply power phosphorus. And the whole concept, as Hopkins writes, is there's, quote, of course, if you look where my cursor is, of course, there's some phosphorus coming to the crop from the subsoil. The of course impresses me because this was obvious back then, and in the handbook, this concept persists. If we look at Hopkins' notebooks, these are his actual notebooks, in this case from 1901. He's doing a lot of work to understand soil types based upon the phosphorus content. So in 1901, he was quantifying total P content of soils to depth to get a sense of total P stocks. And this is, I think, the basis of the of course there's phosphorus in subsoil and it's being used by the crop. Now that concept persists in the state handbook today. I want to now take a moment and talk a bit about the handbook and then share with you some current updates. The reason for walking through the history of phosphorus is that I think it's very telling in understanding what needs to be done next. I hope I've showed you so far that folks like Hopkins were pretty close. They were pretty on the mark with coming up with basic estimates. Now, as we'll talk about next, those estimates that persist in the state handbook are in certainly need of some updates. But to me, it's the creativity that was being thrown around 120 years ago thinking about what are the big questions on phosphorus that we can benefit from. And I'll try to touch on some of those in the next part of this talk. So the state agronomy handbook is updated variously every 5 or 10 years. And shown here are the last two iterations from 2000, and then again the current version, which is simply now online. We no longer make hard copy prints of the handbook for Illinois. And in chapter 8, you find a section on phosphorus, potassium, and pH, as well as the other nutrients, things like micronutrients. I'm going to focus on the P aspect. So this is a figure from chapter 8. And the whole goal of this figure is this number. This is the critical value. The critical soil test value, CSTV, all the same thing. And the basic goal, as we know, is to manage soils to be at or above this critical threshold. The logic being that if we're under the critical value, as we can see from these red curves, that we're missing out on potential yield. Now, note this is a yield maximization, not a profit maximization, and those are not always the same as we know from the MRTN. Now, the bottom chart shows you that depending on what subsoil supply region you're in, from low to high, you have different critical value needs. There's a lot of issues with the current recommendations on phosphorus. Here, just put seven of them, and I will not spend much time on them because I'm sure you're aware that any handbook values from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, which we suspect is true of the actual values in the handbook for Illinois, a lot has changed in agriculture. And so there is a need to update for things just by virtue of we've changed the kinds of hybrids we use, we've changed how we till, the plant populations, etc. Even the tests, we're not really using Bray anymore in most labs. We're using MELIC and using ICP quantification, not colorimetry. So we're trying to update this now and to give you a flavor of what the effort looks like in Illinois. This is being done in tandem with K, where we are using heavily on-farm at scale strip trials. We're doing 4 replicates with and without phosphorus at scale on farmers' fields. It takes a bit more work, I'd say, but I have more confidence in the data given that it's on actual working farms. So our goal is several hundred site years. We have our work cut out for us, and this is just to give you a flavor for the first year's data on the top right. I would not put much stock into this for a few reasons. There's some data cleaning that's to be done, and the choice of model is quite important. And there's philosophical decisions like can you have a relative yield exceeding 100%? Of course you can mathematically. The idea is, does that even make sense to include? But all those considerations aside, and I'd recommend looking at the first initiative, FRST, for more background on those decisions on critical values. The idea is that we're developing curves that look like this. They're a lot messier than those smooth curves we just saw in the handbook, but there is no data that we can find behind the handbook values. Okay, now, one thing that I want to point out that it really intrigues me because it means that we're missing something important on phosphorus is we find that in some fields, like this one shown here, there's no gain in relative yield by adding phosphorus, even though we're at 10 part per million melic ICP. And that value should be probably around 25 to maybe 30 ppm if we're looking at other state recs like Iowa. So here we find that this field it's not an outlier, it's real. So that field itself just doesn't need more than 10 ppm to maximize yield when it comes to phosphorus. In contrast, other fields appear to have a critical value that are exceeding 40 ppm. In this example, we're only getting about 87% of the potential yield. So I want to point this out because the data looks messy. I don't think it's messy so much as it's a unidimensional approach to a more complex outcome of relative yield. And it also points out that we're missing something on phosphorus. So this then to me is the work cut out for us, not just in Illinois, but also in all of the north central states, where we need to figure out what's going on with P such that we can explain why some fields truly have a much higher or a much lower critical value. The other takeaway here is that the critical value of any state recommendation is a pretty good average, but it's just that. It's an average. And not mathematically speaking, but conceptually in terms of how we calculate it. And that means that some fields may just be lower critical value, in which case we're over applying if we're building to the handbook value, but also we might be missing out on yield potential and on dollars if we're building to a value that is lower than what the field is actually at. Now, speaking of averages, one of the insights that we're developing, or not even insights, just realizations to put it more bluntly, is that the maintenance values that are based or predicated on grain P2O5 contents, these are also values that are averages. And, well, as I like to say, beware of the average when there's a large distribution. So what you're seeing here are the distributions of grain P values for corn, soybean, and wheat, and they're being shown as, well, sorry, they exhibit pretty good Gaussian distributions. This is textbook statistics. Now, there's two ways to think about these. What's the percentile? The true average would be the 50th, but the handbook uses the 75th percentile for corn, soybean, and wheat. Now, the rationale here is that it's a safe value. But if we think about this, it might be safe yield-wise if we're putting the 75th percentile grain P2O5 values back on as maintenance. However, by definition, we're over applying for three-fourths of fields that have grain P values, and thus the amount of grain P removal with harvest will be lower than that 75th percentile. Now, this is a tricky situation because no number will adequately address the needs of any given field, whether it's above or below. So I'm not knocking on the handbook so much as pointing out that it's, I think, good to be aware that these handbook values, in this case, the grain P2O5 to calculate how much to put on to replace what you took off with harvest. These are not set in stone perfect values in the sense that they reflect what your field is every time or any given field. Now, here's an example of why this matters. We did an on-farm assessment over 24 site years looking at corn and soybean each. In Bureau County, this is just north of the Illinois River near La Salle, Peru, off of Route 80. And we sampled, among other things, the grain of corn and soybean to understand P2O5 content, shown here on the right-hand side. Now, what I've plotted are the 75th percentile and the 50th percentile P2O5 grain values from the Illinois Agronomy Handbook for corn and soybean. And as we can make out, in most sites in most years in this area, for some reason, the corn P2O5 values are barely cracking what the handbook 50th percentile value is, to say nothing of the 75th. And for soybean, not as bad, but still more than half of the fields are not making the 75th percentile. What this means is that we have lower P2O5 grain content in this area than what the handbook says we should be using to calculate the maintenance rate. So as a result of that, these farmers are over applying phosphate when they're using the handbook values. Now, a question might be asked, how can we make this better? In soil test p-values, looking at how they might be declining during drawdown, etc., they're not exactly great, and they're not exactly tractable for maintenance. They're definitely a very useful tool for other purposes like building soil test P and long-term drawdown. But for maintenance applications, what we're trying to do for the Illinois handbook is to think about direct measurement. We send soils, I'll back up. We grid sample soils and then we send them to commercial labs for very quick turnaround measures of nutrients. Why not grid sample a field for grain, pulling a grain sample off the combine? Or why not just send in a composite from the field to the same labs that can also measure grain P and grain K for that matter content? So I think this is valuable because much like soil testing for phosphorus, we have the ability to think about the back end of the operation, which is the grain. Why not test grain to have region, field, hybrid, etc., specific grain removal values? It will enable more precision in maintenance applications, which means savings on phosphate purchases. What is next? So I've been talking a bit about the background and I've talked about some current considerations. Well, I want to think about the high-hanging fruit. We've picked the low-hanging fruit, folks. I think in agronomy, the easy stuff was done by our predecessors. To be fair, it was probably not easy to them like it is to us. That's hindsight. But I want to emphasize it might be good to think about what are the big breakthroughs that we could provide for producers that would really move the needle on phosphorus, making its use more sustainable economically as well as biophysically. So a few questions that to me pop up that we are currently working on to incorporate into the agronomy handbook updates for Illinois. The first is getting a better sense of P sources for the crop. Crops have a buffet of phosphorus. They can take it up from the fertilizer, starter, or the main application, or it can come from other sources that we are missing by the soil test. For example, organic phosphorus can mineralize to be phosphate, and we've got a lot of inorganic phosphorus from the parent material in our loess-derived soils that blanket the Corn Belt all the way up into parts of Minnesota. So if we do the math, and these are actual values from what we've measured, there is a lot of phosphorus in our prairie soils of the Corn Belt. We're talking just shy of 20,000 pounds in the best cases, but easily over 10,000 pounds in the worst cases. Now, the crop having different sources of phosphorus to take from might in part explain relatively low PU efficiency, which is globally about 16%. The crop has many options, and so it might diminuate what is coming from the application. There are a lot of other reasons for low PUE, so I don't want to say it's only because of this reason. But the bigger point here is, much like for nitrogen credits from organic matter, can we begin to credit phosphorus from these other sources to help inform more judicious, meaning economical, applications? So here's some example of how early season phosphorus is largely derived from the soil, at least what we can tell when we look at two different forms of ammonium phosphates. So this is a study that we did with three soils from central Illinois and Champaign, central north in LaSalle. These are both mollisols. And then we have one from south central. It's an alpha sol from Effingham, a timber soil and two prairie soils. And we've got two P sources, monoammonium phosphate and struvite that we used at 90 pounds of P25 per acre to fertilize corn. And we looked at corn through V7 to try to understand early season uptake. The other form of ammonium phosphate was struvite, which is magnesium ammonium phosphate. It's basically MAP with magnesium. It's a 528 with a 10 mag. And it's slow release. So what you're looking at here on the y-axis is the percent of the biomass phosphorus. So how much of the phosphorus percent-wise in the corn by V7 came from the fertilizer. And so as we can see, the MAP, which is more soluble, was more effective at making it into the crop. Now, the biomass across these different treatments was the same. So this is interesting because it would suggest that, well, even though there was less fertilizer struvite phosphorus in the corn at V7, the corn made up the difference by scavenging from the soil. And all soils had soil tests, meaning melic 3 by ICP, exceeding the critical value. They were well above 40 ppm. So these are soils that I would personally probably not recommend any more building. In fact, one of them at LaSalle was 80 ppm melic P, probably fine to draw down. So these are adequate soils P-wise, but that's also the reality of much of our state. And that's why I think the crop can subsidize lower uptake from the fertilizers seen here for struvite from drawing from soil resources. That's the buffet that I was talking about. Now, the bigger point here is that maximum, the fertilizer by V7 corn, for these soils at least, and this is even for MAP, only provides about 30%, really on average more like 28% of the P uptake. Now, this is just V7, and so we know that going into R1, etc., that's when the majority of P uptake occurs. The point, though, is that soils can afford, they can provision the crop with a lot of their P. And if we look at this entire data set, over 70 to over 90% of the corn uptake of phosphorus by V7 is coming from soil. That to me is really important. I know this is not news to people, but my curiosity here is how can we quantify this and be able to predict this to better inform a more judicious application of phosphorus? So there's two things that we have to consider then. One is how much phosphorus is mineralizing from organic matter, because that's one of the two major non-fertilizer sources in soils. We know that these black prairie soils have thousands of pounds of P per acre in the top, well, in the A horizon, but also just in the top 6 inches. And this organic phosphorus, just like for nitrogen, has to mineralize into the inorganic form. And just like for nitrogen, so too for phosphorus, there are enzymes that plant roots and microbes secrete and they digest they hydrolyze, so they convert organic phosphorus into the orthophosphate form. Now, these enzymes are also acid in soil health, so there's reason to think that this might be where some soil health tests, at least the ones of phosphatase activities, may actually provide mechanistic information for informing how we manage phosphorus. Spoiler, we're not there yet. And spoiler two, might take us another decade of research. But again, I want us to go back and be like Cyril Hopkins in 1904. What are the big questions to tackle? This, I think, is one of them. So we tried to understand the potential value of organic phosphorus in Illinois soil types, looking across different sites shown here, different soil types. And what I want to draw your attention to is the first finding that the amount of organic P in these top 6-inch depths of soils, organic P was the majority of total phosphorus. So the total P content, not the soil test, 60+% came from or was present in the organic P form. And of the amount that could mineralize, which we can assess using radioactive isotopes and some fancy lab techniques, the potentially mineralizable phosphorus pool, like we do for nitrogen, it was quite large. It ranged from 24 to 200 pounds of P per acre. Now, I'm not saying that that much is going to mineralize in a growing season or even half of that. We frankly don't know. But this again is a potentiality argument. The soil has the amount of organic P there, and it has the metabolism. It has the enzymes to break down organic P at that amount per acre during a growing season. So that's not trivial. If even a third of that were to happen during a growing season, and this is P, not P205, we're talking a appreciable contribution to crop uptake. So just like for nitrogen, then the goal is to try to understand what actually happens in the growing season and can you forecast that? And that's a question of weather, but also for P, a lot of biogeochemistry that we have yet to untangle. The other concept here is subsoil supply, which we talked about, and we talked about how the origins of this are from the Hopkins notebooks, thinking about subsoil P. And this is really the gray area here, the 15,000 pounds of P in gray fonts that we saw a few slides back. This is subsoil P, largely inorganic, largely apatite calcium phosphates. So is there a basis for this? Well, by soil sampling these sites across the state, we were able to make a P map. This is total P pounds per acre. Note the units, we're getting into the thousands of pounds in the top 35 inches. If we go down to the by 2 more feet to the top 5 feet, we find even more phosphorus there. So why is this useful for the agronomy handbook concept of subsoil P supply power? Well, we can look at and try to begin to validate the map in the handbook on the right with what we're actually measuring. So if it's true that there's subsoil supply power regions of low, medium, and high, that should be reflected to some degree by the amount of P stocks. And in some cases, as we see here in green, there is correspondence, but in some cases shown here in red, there is not correspondence. So this would suggest that soil nutrient maps are probably a better way to go about the validation. The next step would be to actually quantify uptake from subsoil using radioisotopes. And that really, I think, is needed to confirm the ability and the amount. Does it actually matter magnitude-wise, subsoil P uptake? The second concept to build into the handbook, more of an approach or a new concept, not really a recommendation, is that of legacy or residual phosphorus. And a simple definition of this is that it's phosphorus that was put on in the past and not used. So that's where the inputs exceed the outputs. Inputs being fertilizer or manure, and outputs being the harvest of biomass, be it silage or be it grain, etc. So this is what's left over. It presents water quality challenges, but the first use of this term was in Iowa, 1925. Basically, can we front load 10 years of phosphorus for corn in 1 year, or do we break it up as annual or biannual applications? And the biannual, as we all know, went out. So why does this matter? There's a lot of legacy P in soils that can explain high test values that are also causing nutrient losses, phosphate specifically today, but also could be a way to that could be a piggy bank account. We can do drawdown where we apply beneath the maintenance rate or beneath the maintenance application rate, excuse me, to decrease the soil test value. And we're basically mining P. Short-term mining of soil phosphorus is not a problem if we've built it up to very high levels. So mining itself is not inherently, I think, a problem. Now, how much P is there, legacy P wise, excuse me, in soils across Illinois? Well, we can do a rough estimate using this paper by Dr. David from 2000, which I've redrawn here with colors to give you a sense of the net accumulation that occurred from 1965 from 1985. If we sum up that amount, it's about 4.9 billion pounds. That's an average of 203 pounds of pea per acre across the croplands of the state. But that's an average, which, well, you know the theme. Beware of averages. How much of a relative increase? Well, there's about 95 billion pounds of pea in soils already, as I just showed you, from the Hopkins notebooks to our modern measurements. So 4.9 billion pounds seems like a lot, but now in context, it's only about a 5% enrichment. Now that's an average. There's going to be places that have a lot more or a lot less. And a good example here is that of the Morrow plots. So the Morrow plots were established in 1876. We have records beginning in 1888 on what went on and what came off the field. And we can make up a P balance like this. This is corn on corn every year for 145 years at the time of sampling in 2021. We have a fertilized and an unfertilized treatment shown by the phases. And what I want to point out here is that the majority of the legacy P that we have today was incurred in the 1908 through 1920 period as rock phosphate. Again, as well, when there was a period of buildup until soil testing was being used by the 2000s to not just apply high amounts, but to apply or not apply based on the soil test results. So the point here is that we can build up a lot of soil test values and even just total P stocks, which is what we're measuring here, in a very short amount of time. And that P is not going anywhere. It's going to stay there for quite some time. The question might be asked, can we try to track legacy P or how can we monitor this? And in general, what we know is that residual phosphorus or legacy phosphorus can be qualitatively estimated by soil tests. And qualitatively just means if you have a higher soil test value, you probably have more residual or legacy P. Now, again, legacy P is agnostic to the time scale. That could have been from 4 or 5 years ago of building up, which is a legacy P application by definition, or it could have been from 1910, as seen in this example here. Now, the problem is that the soil test values are not typically that strongly correlated with the amount of excess beyond crop need P. So it's hard to get a very quantitative sense of the amount. To show this, here we have a graph demonstrating that we've got with the same two treatments, and green is fertilized and gray is unfertilized. Please excuse that blue line. I don't know what that's doing there. And we've got two different depths. And we've got the balance where you can make out, hopefully, that we're above the zero line for the fertilized treatment and we're at a fairly high positive P balance. And the soil test values are shown here as by depth, circle for top depth, and by triangle, the bottom depth. So as we increase the P balance, the legacy P in this treatment that is fertilized, we find that yeah, we are increasing the amount of melic P measured. But in the unfertilized treatment in gray that we're mining, we're in the negative balance. Note that in the gray values, the melic P tests, they're not really changing. They're coming down a little bit from 1960 to present day, but you would expect them to be a lot lower, certainly under deficiency values, but they're not. They're still hanging out around pound per acre, about 30 to even 50 pounds per acre. So this suggests, one, that soils can replenish the soil test P pool. It's not just from fertilizer, but also that it's not super quantitative an approach to track or even just to gauge how much P you have as legacy that you can mine. And if you look at the correlations, same data set, the correlations being poor indicate this. Nothing to write home about when you've got an R squared of about 0.26 on a good day. So, with that, I want to summarize the major points. As I hope to have shown you, how we've managed phosphorus has gone from basically not a thing to very intensive in less than 200 years in the Corn Belt of the north central US region. This is quite a change. Um, the phases, as we talked about, were from basically not any phosphorus input, and thus P mining, to rock phosphate, to superphosphates briefly, to the ammonium phosphates. And I would argue that about 100 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century, we understood the basics. I showed you examples on harvest index, on the maintenance concept. These were figured out more or less by the 1910s, and we have certainly improved upon the finer details, but the basic math and the basic concepts were already there. One concept that I think we've gotten away from is the economics. Is the P paying for itself? And today we also have what they didn't have, which is the added consideration of water quality. So now we have to juggle the economics and the agronomics also with the environmental implications of how we manage phosphorus. A lot is being asked of phosphorus today. So, what lies ahead? What would be our big questions that Hopkins had back in 1904? Well, one would be non-fertilizer contributions, organic matter and subsoil apatitic phosphorus in particular. Can we predict them quantitatively to help dial in the applications better? These will be tough to crack, but I think it can be done. The second concept that I talked about is legacy phosphorus. How much and how to use it. These are tough to answer because the soil tests don't quite get us the total legacy pool. They do track well in a qualitative fashion. So there's a lot of work I think to be done here as well. And the third theme that I've talked about is let's really, I think, dive deeper into these quote unquote outliers or quote messy data. Let's think about field specific approaches from soil testing, but also for maintenance, as I gave the example of for the grain removal rates. So, with that, I wish to thank you for your time, and I believe there's a live session now where I'm available for questions. Thank you and take care. Bye.